Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ, King of endless glory. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ, King of endless glory. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. There was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem at the sheep gate a pool called in Hebrew Bethesda, with 5 porticos. In this lay a large number of ill, blind, lame, and crippled. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been ill for a long time, he said to him, "Do you wish to be well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. While I'm on my way, someone else gets down there before me." Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your mat, and walk." Immediately the man became well, took up his mat, and walked. Now that day was a Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who was cured, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to carry your mat." He answered them, "The man who made me well told me, 'Take up your mat and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who told you, 'Take it up and walk'?" The man who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away since there was a crowd there. After this, Jesus found him in the temple area and said to him, "Look, you are well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went and told the Jews that Jesus was the one who had made him well. Therefore the Jews began to persecute Jesus because he did this on a Sabbath. The Gospel of the Lord. Prophet Ezekiel this morning. Prophet Ezekiel is my favorite prophet in the Old Testament. The prophet Ezekiel is both an exciting story to read, but also the prophet Ezekiel is a very interesting and fascinating, and also many times confusing prophet of the Old Testament. St. Jerome once said that people shouldn't read Ezekiel until they're 50 years old because it can be very confusing. But Ezekiel is also a very relevant prophet because Ezekiel is the most influential prophet on the book of Revelation. Ezekiel, I would also argue, is one of the most Catholic prophets of the Old Testament. So many roots of our Catholic faith, you can see hints of them in the prophet Ezekiel. The prophet Ezekiel, a main subject of his prophecy was the temple, as is the case with many of the prophets. But Ezekiel in particular had many prophecies about the temple. It is the prophet Ezekiel, for example, who many fundamentalist Christians would cite when they talk about the temple needing to be rebuilt so that the Messiah might come again. You guys have heard me mention this before, that one of the reasons why many modern American Christians have such an interest in Israel, it's not always just for political reasons. It's also for reasons of their faith. There are many people who think that in order for Jesus to come back, the state of Israel has to be reestablished and the temple in Jerusalem has to be rebuilt. That comes from the prophet Ezekiel. The prophet Ezekiel, his prophecies begin in the beginning of the book with the foreshadowing of the temple's destruction and the wickedness of the priests in the temple. And then the book of Ezekiel ends with an 8-chapter vision that Ezekiel has about the future temple. And so many people think this means, well, it hasn't been fulfilled yet, and they take it completely literally. We as Catholics, we don't take it so literally. We see it as a sort of mystical vision that Ezekiel has. And one of the most famous lines of this vision we heard this morning in chapter 47. "The angel brought me, Ezekiel, back to the entrance of the temple of the Lord, and I saw water flowing out from beneath the threshold of the temple toward the east. The water flowed down from the right side of the temple, south of the altar." And then Ezekiel goes on to see that this water went about and basically was revivifying everything that it touched. Right? So the saints and the Catholic Church, for the most part, sees this as a mystical vision fulfilled in the church, that the water flowing from the church goes about revivifying the world. Right? But there's also another mystical aspect of this that many of the church fathers commented on, is that they saw this as a sort of mystical prefiguration of what happened at the crucifixion as well, right? Because Jesus is the true and everlasting temple. Right? And so when Jesus was struck on the cross, it was not only blood that flowed from his side, which you would expect, but also water. Water flowing from the true temple. Right, there's other reasons for this, why there was blood and water that flowed from Christ's side. St. John Chrysostom famously said that the blood and water represents the sacraments, right? The sacrament of the Eucharist and the sacrament of baptism. Other people said it represented the two kinds of baptism, the sacramental baptism with water or the baptism of martyrs, the baptism by blood. But there's also a sort of mysterious way, if you read the Old Testament, that you can see more prefigurations of this. For example, you guys remember the rock that Moses struck in the desert, right? And we know that water flowed from the rock, right? The interesting thing about that rock from the Old Testament is that there were many Jewish traditions that surrounded that theology of the rock, and we actually see hints of them in the New Testament, right? For example, St. Paul in 1 Corinthians, he said that that rock that followed them was Christ, right? And that rock was struck just as Christ was struck. So there was Jewish traditions around that rock that basically thought that the rock was not just a one-time occurrence, because remember it happened in the book of Exodus, but also again in the book of Numbers. Moses struck the rock and water came out. There was another Jewish tradition surrounding it that not only did water come out from the rock, but also blood. Blood and water came out from the rock. And there was a Jewish tradition surrounding that instance. And of course, St. Paul says that that rock was a foreshadowing or a type of Christ. Also, the Jews would have seen in the blood and water, they would have seen another significance. That when this water is flowing out from the east side of the temple, it wasn't just water that was flowing out. Because the way the temple was constructed in Jerusalem, obviously you know that the main activities that took place in the temple were the animal sacrifices, right? So there was constantly blood being poured out upon the altar from the animal sacrifice. And so the Jews, when they built the temple, realizing that this was going to be a pretty messy endeavor, they made basically an aqueduct that led from the bottom of the altar out to the Kidron River. And so every time they had those animal sacrifices, especially at the great Jewish feast when there were so many animals sacrificed, particularly at the Feast of Passover, every year, if you would have looked out to the Kidron River, you would have seen blood and water flowing out from the temple. So all of these images come to mind with this crucifixion of Jesus. And the Catholic Church has always seen this vision of Ezekiel as yet another foreshadowing of Christ's own crucifixion. When Ezekiel saw water flowing from the temple, he saw that as an image of a foreshadowing of the church, but also a mysterious foreshadowing of Christ's own water and blood that flowed from his side, the true temple on the cross.